Thank you, Keith, and welcome everyone. I'm not sure how many. Looks like there's several here in the room, so we'll just go ahead and jump right into this. Obviously, you can see that we're going to be talking about the Public Land Survey System. Some may know a little bit about it, some may know very little about it, but I'll guarantee you that everybody has seen. Let me get onto my screen here. Everybody has seen that, right? So as we talk about from the GIS perspective, you'll see a layer many times that looks similar to that, and that represents the Public Land Survey System. So interesting, just some historical background here. I'll spend a little time with just a little bit of history and then jump into kind of what it looks like in the state of Idaho. So back in 1961, when the first astronauts went into space, they orbited the Earth a few times and they came back and they were asked specifically, what can you see from space? And it was kind of an interesting answer. Both of their answers, they actually mentioned two things. And if I had an opportunity to ask you a question, you'd give me several ideas of what they could see from space. But there were two things that they mentioned very, very quickly. One was the Great Wall of China. Very obvious from space. They could see it traversing out through the mountains. The second thing they said that they could see was the checkerboard effect of the Midwestern United States. So as we look at this particular diagram, that's exactly what they could see. I mean, those types of patterns were what they were actually seeing from space. And so, you know, we laugh about that and say, well, surveyors have made their mark on the Earth. We can actually see that what's been done is there and has been there for generations and will continue to be maintained throughout the time. You'll notice, though, this is actually one. It's local. It's just out. You'll notice down here in the lower right-hand corner is, for those here locally, it's American Falls Reservoir, and we're talking about agriculture crops, right? And as you notice, those squares are very specific to the Public Land Survey System that we'll talk about here in detail today. But if we look at those, squares, keep messing things up here. If we look at those squares, they're very specific to that Public Land Survey System in that, where did they come from? What do they mean? And as a layer on the PLSS, or as a layer in your GIS, it's very specific to what it is that people own and what it is that this entire United States actually looks like from a surveying perspective. So again, just looking at the United States, if we look at this particular diagram, you'll notice that the eastern seaboard is white. Not part of the Public Land Survey System. So if you have experience or have had experience or will have in those eastern states, including Texas, they're not part of the Public Land Survey System. What happened, if we just look at historical context here just a little bit, we went back right after around 1776. We know what was going on around that time in the United States. They were just coming off from a war. They were extremely in debt and were acquiring properties to the west. And so for a number of reasons, they were talking about, the federal government was saying, well, we're going to take that property that we own, we're going to split it up, and we're going to give parcels to our soldiers for their service in the war. And we were in debt, so we're going to figure out ways to basically sell property, if you will, or at least that's the word I'm looking for. Basically, get rid of the property, dispose of the property, and basically, but in order for them to do that, it had to be surveyed first. So Thomas Jefferson and others were kind of the brainchild behind some of this. They started over here in Ohio and other parts of the South. But if you look at Ohio specifically, it's a mishmash of many things. And so they were kind of in the process of trying to figure out, how are we going to dispose of this property? How are we going to survey it so that it's equitable and it's it's, I won't say easy, but it was a way for them to dispose of the property very simply, to describe it and then be able to dispose of it. So you'll notice that as they started in Ohio, they tried several different systems. They finally came up with the one which you will, if you talk about it around the world, it's second to none as it relates to being able to dispose of property with the intent, and the acreages and everything in terms of what we refer to as aliquot parts, or equal parts, equal areas. So they literally came from the Ohio River Valley, and they headed west. As they headed west, they were setting, you'll notice on this particular map, there are several what we refer to as baselines and meridians. You'll notice out here in the Midwestern United States, we have what's referred to as the sixth principal meridian. And so these meridian lines are longitudinal lines, and our baselines are latitudinal lines. And so as we look at these baselines and these initial points throughout the United States, several states, in some cases, several states are laid off from a particular baseline and meridian. In the state of Idaho, we look at Idaho as being baseline and meridian start. If any of you are online and from the Boise area, you'll know what Boise and meridian looks like. That meridian line is established on and along Meridian Road. So if we go south of Boise, south of Meridian actually, if you look at the Boise area, when we run Meridian Road south, Highway 69, if we continue south, it actually jogs over into Kuna, comes down on Swan Falls Road, continues south for several miles, and then jogs back over to an area here. We'll get it here in a second, where Idaho began. There we go. Just get my mouse working here. So if we go to this area right here, just straight south of Meridian, there's the initial point for Idaho, represented by a baseline parallel of latitude running east and west, and a longitudinal line through that point running north and south. That's what we refer to as the initial point in the state of Idaho. Everything starts there, and then we go into, which will be our next piece when we talk about these original survey maps. This is actually what the original survey that starts. This is actually one north, one east from the Boise initial point. So if we look at, if we're going one north and one east, then our initial point is going to be right here on this particular map. This map was done in the original survey of Idaho, starting at the initial point, was done in 1868, 69. And then some of these subsequent maps were done in the later in the 1870s and 1880s. But if you just look at the initial point being this southwest corner of this particular township, this is a township. If we look at the next one here, here's one north, one west, okay? So our initial point would be one north, one west, initial point would be over here. So again, just in brief, we'll talk about what these townships are, but as you look at your overlay, your layer for the public land survey system, these townships were measured out 6 miles by 6 miles. And if we think about them doing that in the 1800s, the methods that they used at that point in time were rudimentary at best. There were compasses and chains of 66 feet in length. And so as they were dragging those chains and using compasses, they basically, starting from Ohio, did that same process across the United States. Techniques changed as they went, but for the most part, all the measurements were done with a 66-foot chain, okay? So if we take that 66 feet chain, and if you look on some of your maps, you'll notice that they might say 80 chains or 40 chains. Well, 80 chains is 5,280 feet. So their intent was that they were going to lay these out 6 miles by 6 miles. Then they would go up to the next one. They'd lay out 6 miles by 6 miles. Then they would come back in and they would lay out 36 sections inside of that 6 miles by 6 miles. Each one of these sections then being 1 mile by 1 mile. And so if we think of this as being the Boise meridian going this way and baseline going this way, for those of you who are in the eastern Idaho area, this baseline runs, if you're familiar with where Shelley is, that baseline is just on the south side of Shelley, runs all the way, basically a latitudinal line all the way through the state, all the way to the Wyoming border. And so then they would come in here. They would literally, just to give you a real brief how they did it, once they had that 6 mile by 6 mile township staked, surveyed with a mark every 1/2 mile, they then came in and started 1 mile from the southeast corner, and they would go up a 1/2 mile, another 1/2 mile, go in a 1/2 mile, and over and check in. And they were doing these on a 66-foot chain and setting a point every 1/2 mile, again, from Ohio to the Pacific Ocean. So as we look at that, and one of the things that probably relates the most to the GIS side of things is the intent was that these were exactly 1 mile by 1 mile, and that these were 6 miles by 6 miles. In reality, and in the real world, that is never the case, okay? So when we start looking at a grid, most of those grids on your GIS are going to be relatively rudimentary. They're not, they may be developed by corners on the ground, but in some cases they may not be. They may be projections. And so you can't use those lines exactly, maybe as being exact, because they may be projected as 5,280 feet when in fact they never are, because we're required that as we develop these sections that have been previously surveyed, the monuments that were set originally in the 1800s are what verifies, or what basically is used for the actual corner of the section itself. So that 1 mile by 1 mile will never be 5,280 feet by 5,280 feet. So that's why you see lines on your maps going in kind of on angles and different directions, and they don't look like perfect squares. It's because in the resurvey, those corners were found, and even though they did their best to make them 1 mile by 1 mile, in today's methods of measuring, there's just no way that we can find exactly 1 mile between found monuments. And then we take from sections, we've got 36 sections numbered. So if you take a township, they're going to be numbered in a serpentine effect. So section 1 in the northeast corner, and then it's serpentine 6, 7, 8, wraps around all the way to where section 36 is in the southeast corner. So as you talk about sections, township, and ranges, you see legal descriptions that deal with sections, township, and ranges. Just know that there's 36 sections, and then in each one of those sections, it can be broken down into what we refer to as aliquot parts or equal parts based on the quarter of those sections. You'll see that on most of your GIS maps, you'll see these points. A lot of times you'll see points around these sections. The 4 corners are referred to as section corners, and the 4 intermediate corners are referred to as quarter corners. And some people will ask, well, why quarter corner not instead of half corner, because it's halfway between here and there. Well, the quarter corner basically breaks the section into 4 pieces or 4 quarters. So they're referred to as quarter corners. And then inside that, there's a numbering convention that goes beyond that. But each one of these quarter section, all the way down to even down to a 2.5 acre parcel, could be aliquot parts based on, you know, the northwest of the northwest of the northwest of the northwest of the northwest, whatever. And we continue to break these quarters down mathematically to where we can determine acreages based on aliquot parts, and very, very quickly and easily. Measuring them on the ground is a little more technical, but mathematically they're very, very easy to identify. And the nice thing about it, where I mentioned that it was bar none the best system in the world, it's all about aliquot and equity. You talk about aliquot parts, there's no question what I own. Acreage is a different story, but what I own is very, very clear, and there's no discrepancy. So with that, hopefully that makes some sense. Just the last picture here, several years ago, Raj and Mayher, they took a trip to Initial Point with some students, and basically there they are on the monument. Since that photo was taken, there's a new monument there that was updated a few years back, and very, very permanent. It's quite a sight to see out south of town, where there's nothing but jackrabbits, whistle pigs, and sagebrush that hasn't burned. But anyway, that was just kind of a field trip of sorts, where being able to establish and be there is kind of fun. And one of the things that we looked at last time we were out there is the original notes of the surveyor from 1868, I think it was, where he talked about where that monument was. And as you stand there on that monument and look around with his notes in hand, you can see exactly what he saw. He talks about an outcropping. He talks about a ridge. He talks about other things in his handwritten notes, where you can stand there and see exactly what he saw back in the day. There hasn't been much change other than this monument's been updated and there's been some railing put around it. But very, very cool in terms of historical data as it relates to PLSS in the state of Idaho. With that, I would stand for questions or comments, input from others if need be.
Well, that's excellent, Darren. Folks, you can feel free to unmute yourself at this time if you have a question, or if you don't have a microphone, feel free to add that your question into the chat. I see one question for you, Darren. Interesting place to start, writes John. Curious why that point was chosen.
You know, and that's always probably the number one question. Even at that time, the capital wasn't necessarily right in Boise, but they were instructed to find something that was kind of a high point, something that was very noticeable. Well, when you leave Meridian and you head south down Meridian Road, the only thing that you see sitting out in that desert is this Initial Point butte. Very pronounced. Just happened to be a place to start. They could have started anywhere, but more than likely they were in and around the Capitol at the time, and the charge was given, and here you go, take it away. So kind of interesting.
Yeah, very good. I see that scrolling through the chat a little bit here, I see Jeannie also put in pretty much the same information, high point above the surrounding area. So very good. Now, I have a question, Darren. Can you go to the, I think it's forward one more slide or two more slides? Yeah, no, one more. No, one more. Where did it go? Forward.
There. Oh, on the Google Earth image?
No, go to, the one where you had drawn out the quarter sections and stuff like that.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
That one right there. So what always confuses me, maybe you can explain a method to the madness here, is we look at section 14 and how it was broken down. So 640 acres, full square mile, supposed to be.
Right.
Quarter section 160, supposed to be. And that's pretty easy. So we're looking at the northwest quarter of section 14. But the way to read it there is, okay, that's the northeast quarter of the northwest quarter. That's a 40-acre section, right? Or portion. I shouldn't say section anymore. But see, so for me, it was always confusing that the way you might write that is you'd start off with in the northwest quarter, but then you'd move to the left side of it and write that it's the northeast quarter of the northwest quarter.
Exactly. So when I teach students that very question,
Mm-hmm.
the best way to go from a legal description that might say northeast quarter to northwest quarter is go backwards. Go to the far right side, which will be your largest parcel, right? So if we went one more, if I broke this down 4 more times, and I was talking about this 1 quarter up here, I would go to the largest part first, would be the northwest quarter. So here's my northwest quarter. My next smallest piece would be the northeast quarter of that northwest quarter. And then if I went 1 more, I would be the northeast quarter of the northeast quarter of the northwest quarter. So it's easier to start at the back, to put it onto paper, write it backwards.
Yeah, so we would read that particular term, let's say, from the right to the left.
Correct.
Yeah, very good. There are some other questions coming in. We have a little bit of time left. Let's see. There's a question regarding government lots. Can you explain a little bit about that? And also, this might get into the long lots that have appeared in the parts of the United States along the Fox River and stuff. I don't know if you can speak to that.
Absolutely. So a government lot, the easiest way to describe a government lot is a non-aliquot part. So as the aliquot parts were divided, 40 chains by 40 chains, 20 chains by 20 chains, 10 chains by 10 chains, an aliquot part, which was equal, they would push all of the air as they calculated these, because of the way that they surveyed, going from south to north and from west to east, they were pushing all of their air north inside of the township and west inside of the township. And so as they pushed that air, and I do have one of these shows government lots, okay? Oops. They pushed everything to the north and to the west. So in this particular very common section, you're going to have government lots along the north tier of sections 1 through 6, and then along the west side of sections 7, 12, 18, 19, 30, 31. Okay. And those government lots are basically a non-aliquot part. So as they pushed that air, when they ran out of aliquot parts, if they were 19 chains away from the boundary line, it would become an aliquot part. If it was 20 chains, then it will continue to be an aliquot part. But anything that's government lots would typically be a non-aliquot part. So you see them typically along the north and west sides of typical sections along the exterior of the township. You will also see government lots around bodies of water. When they come up to the body of water and they can't get an aliquot part, they'll form a government section or a government lot there. There will be government lots in the Boise area. There are government lots in and around Fort Boise and in and around the townships or the town sites of Pocatello. And some of these, because the cities were there, the town sites were there before this public lands came through, then you may have some government lots up along something that was previously surveyed, but just know that government lot is a non-aliquot part.